the superior. He is described as the most courageous, which in that context means the most manly, the most virile. And later Socrates admits that he has always been full of wonder at the nature of the two brothers. And at 368a, he cites a line of poetry, you remember, written about them for their distinction in battle. They have been in war. They have been tested in war, obviously. They are also, and we see this from their relationship between one another and the way they speak to one another, they are also highly competitive super achievers. A little bit like some of you, perhaps. There is quite a bit of jousting between them that you need to be attentive to. And each proposes to Socrates a test that he will have to pass in order to prove the value of justice and the just life. Glaucon goes on to rehabilitate the argument of Thrasymachus in many ways in a more vivid and a more expressive way than Thrasymachus did himself. Glaucon tells a story, you remember. Yes. A story that he modifies from the historian Herodotus. A story about a man named Gyges who possessed a magic ring that conferred on him the power of invisibility. Who has not wondered what we would do if we had this power? The power of invisibility. Gyges, in Glaucon's retelling of the story, Gyges uses this ring to murder the king and to sleep with his wife and to set himself up as king. What would you do if you had this power of this magic ring, where you could commit any crime, indulge any vice, commit any outrage, and be sure you could always get away with it? Why, if you could do that, would you wish to be just at the same time, or wish to be just instead of that? This is the challenge that Glaucon poses to Socrates. Why would someone with absolute power and complete immunity to punishment, why would they prefer justice to injustice? Tell me that, Socrates, Glaucon asks. If justice truly is something praiseworthy for itself alone, then Socrates should be able to provide an answer that will satisfy Glaucon's retelling of the story of Gyges. That is certainly a very tall order. And that is where the brother, Adeimantus, chimes in. Adeimantus has a somewhat different set of concerns. He has heard justice praised his whole life, from parents and from poets and from other authorities, but for the most part he has only heard justice praised again for the benefits justice confers, both in this life and the next. Honesty is the best policy. We've heard Cephalus being concerned about returning to others what you owe as a way of pleasing the gods in the afterlife. And Adeimantus rightly takes this kind of argument to mean that justice is simply a virtue for the weak, the lame, and the unadventurous. If you are only concerned with the consequences. A real man does not fear the consequences of injustice. Rather, Adeimantus's concern, and he gives a very revealing image of what he takes justice to be, is with an image of self-guardianship or self-control. He tells us at 367a that each would be his own guard. In other words, we should not care what people say about us, but we should be prepared to develop qualities of self-containment, autonomy, and independence from the influence that others can exercise over us. How can I develop those qualities of self-guardianship or self-control, he asks Socrates. And who has not felt that way before? The two brothers desire to hear justice praised for itself, Glaucon, and to live freely and independently, Adiamantus. And that shows to some degree, I think, their own sense of alienation from their own society. If I can put the case for them slightly anachronistically, these are two sons of the upper bourgeoisie who feel degraded by the mendacity and the hypocrisy of the world they see around them. In any way, what person with any sensitivity to greatness has not felt this way at one time or another? The two are open to persuasion, to consider alternatives, perhaps even radical alternatives to the society that has nurtured them. They are, to put it another way, perhaps not only potential rulers and potential philosophers, they may also be potential revolutionaries. And the remainder of the book is addressed to them and, of course, people like them. With the speeches of Glaucon and Adiamantus, you might say the circle around Socrates is effectively closed. He knows he will not be returning to Athens that evening, and he proposes to the two brothers and those listening to the conversation a kind of thought experiment that he hopes will work magic on the two. Let us propose, he says, to watch a city coming into being in speech. Let us create a city in speech. It is easier, he says, to view justice, not to view justice microscopically in an individual, but rather let's view justice, as it were, through a magnifying glass. Let's view justice in the large sense. Let us view justice in a city in order to help us understand what it is in an individual. And this idea that the city is essentially analogous to the soul, that the city is like the soul, is the central metaphor around which the entire republic is constructed. It seems to be presented entirely innocuously. No one in the dialogue objects to it, yet everything else follows from this idea that the city, the polis, is in certain essential respects like an individual, like the soul of an individual. What is Socrates trying to do here? And what is that metaphor, that central metaphor, in what function does it serve within the work? To state the obvious, Socrates introduces this analogy to help the brothers better understand what justice is for an individual soul. The governance of the soul, Adiamantus's standard of self-control, must be like the governance of a city in some decisive respects. But in what respects? How is a city like a soul? And in what respect is self-governance, the control of one's passions and appetites, in what respect is self-control like the governance of a collective body? Consider the following example. When we say that so-and-so is typically American, or typically, to take Taiwanese, for example, we mean that that person expresses certain traits of character and behavior that are broadly representative in some way of the cross-section of their countrymen. Is this a useful way to think? More specifically, what does it mean to say that an individual can be seen as magnified in his or her country, or that one's country is simply the collective expression of certain individual traits of character? That seems to be what Socrates is suggesting, right? Is that what he's getting at? One way of thinking about the metaphor of city and soul together is to think of it as a particular kind of causal hypothesis about the formation of both individual character and political institutions. In this reading of the city-soul analogy as a kind of causal relation maintains the view that as individuals we both shape and determine the character of our societies, and that those societies in turn shape and determine individual character. The city and soul analogy could be seen then as an attempt to understand how societies reproduce themselves and how they shape citizens who again in turn shape the societies in which they inhabit. That seems to be one way of making sense of the city-soul hypothesis, but again, it doesn't seem to answer the question, in what way are cities and individuals alike? To take the American case, for example, does it mean that something like the presidency, the Congress, and the court can be discerned within the soul of every American citizen? I mean, that would be absurd to think that, obviously. I mean, I think it would be absurd. Maybe you want to argue it, and we could have a discussion. But it might mean that American democracy, or democracy of any kind, helps to produce a particular kind of democratic soul. Just like, you might say, the old regime in France, the old aristocratic society existing before the Revolution, tended to produce a very different kind of soul, a very different kind of individual. Every regime will produce a distinctive kind of individual, and this individual will come to embody the dominant character traits of the particular regime. The remainder of the Republic is again devoted to crafting a regime that will produce a distinctive kind of human character. And that, of course, is why the book is a utopia. There has never been a regime in history that was so single-mindedly devoted to the end